just absolutely destroyed. And then, of course, I found out that my mother had not come back and that she most likely was gassed in Auschwitz. That was one thing which I found out, but I had no way of finding that out until I actually had returned, and that my father had come back to Prague time before me because he was liberated by the Soviets and therefore had a better chance to return months before I was liberated, or we were liberated in Dachau. So that is something which we didn't know, so we went back. And some friend of mine, a man very well known, fellow inmate of mine who wrote the Alfred Kantor book, you know, some of by Alfred Kantor, the concentration camp pictures, the book of Alfred Kantor it's called, and it's exceedingly well done because it contains original drawings from concentration camps scenes. Anyway, so he decided at that time that there was no reason for him to return to Prague, and instead he went to the United States, arranged to be sent to the United States because he had relatives here in the United States, so he didn't go back at all where he came. So you had lots of alternatives. I had that alternative also. Or some other people went to displaced person camps until they could find out where they could emigrate. And that happened. And some of the people who didn't want to return to, as Richard was talking about, to these various places which by that time were occupied by the Soviets, had become part of the Soviet Union, decided not to return and went to displaced persons camps and tried to immigrate to some other country like Australia or New Zealand or Canada, United States and what have you.
Three-part question. After your experience in the camps, like your feeling about the death penalty today, would like mine bring it into the Demjanjuk trial, whether you think that trial serves the purpose, and what you feel about his being given the death penalty.
Right. I don't have any questions about serving the purpose because I think the trial should continue as long as there are people who are accused to be perpetrators. I don't think there's any question about it. Philosophically, I oppose the penalty as a matter of principle. And I think these people, if we use them for other purposes, namely to find out why they functioned the way they did, help to do research so that people can gain some insights which are very necessary, better understanding personality and situations in which people are out of character, or to what extent people are very consistent in playing their roles, which maybe have a sadistic overtone or undertone, if you will. That I think is exceedingly useful and very important, and I think should continue. But again, there are different philosophical perspectives, and some people may be of the opinion that death penalty is which is justifiable, and I oppose it because many very different reasons, and I think they can be put to use, if I can put it that way, put to use in a more constructive way than just simply kill them for whatever they've done. He has, as you have read in the papers, and you may have listened in the broadcast, he has consistent time that he was that person, and that he is a victim of a mistaken identity. I don't have the facts. There is no question that a person of this nature existed. Whether or not he's the person is a question of facts and evidence, which I don't have. But to respond very clearly,
is for Nazis and their collaborators. It's the only instance, I think also in treason in time of war, but that has never been put to effect. So there is a special law for Nazis, and that's the law under which he was sentenced.
So that's very helpful, this information
and the only person ever executed was Eichmann, Adolf Eichmann.
You know, of course, that Germany, for example, does not have a death penalty. And there are a number of people who have been sentenced to multiple life sentences, who otherwise would have been sentenced to death, and are still around and so to speak, die one by one of old age in various prisons in Germany. And most of them are in prison and have paid in prison. Yes.
In reading
Of my system in finding out how this is possible. And to this, more or less, I've dedicated part of my life. Just need to find out, I needed to have answers, because when I came out, I said, how is it possible that human beings can be so cruel and do that to each other? And that was a very burning question. And I need to get it out of my system. The only way I was able to get it out of the system, which was my personal, is to objectify. Try to objectify what used to be a very personal experience to millions. And I found people who were very understanding, very supportive of that. And so I wrote books, I did research, and have gone back to the perpetrators, lived with them, shared lots of time with them and activities, whatever. They know. That's something which I disagree with. I've discussed it with her in detail when we met the last time. Unfortunately, shortly afterwards, she died of cancer. She smoked like a chimney, by the way.
I don't know what banal means.
Banal.
Ordinary, plain, mediocre, commonplace.
Commonplace, yes. So that these people whom we consider to be monsters in different situations are very different from you and I, and cannot be really distinguished. Some of these people I've interviewed and then developed some sort of social relationship. If you had met them, you'd say, yes, I like to have them as friends. They are very nice people, and yet there were desk chair, armchair perpetrators who were actually working on the blueprint of mass extermination. And if you had met them without knowing their background, say, how nice, this is a person I like to have as a friend. And I was shocked, I was absolutely devastated, because I went into this sort of research with a preconceived idea that all these people have to be sadistic and monsters. And I was shocked when I found out that they're not that different from me or anyone else I knew. Now, so what I'm coming back to your original question, my way of coming to terms with my past, in many camps, I was in about 5 camps, and before that I was in the underground and all that, I was going to talk about that, talking about resistance. Yes, there was plenty of it, except I don't go around saying, hey, I was this and that, it's not my style. Some out of the woodwork say, yeah, hey, I was this and that and all that. I'm very sick of that. I just don't relate to that too bad. So the interesting part was that I had a need to find out who these people were, and I needed to talk to them. And some of them found out, and I told them what happened to me, and it was just unbelievable, the relationship which after that. And the people who do my research or help to do my research provide me with are exactly those people who were former perpetrators. And to them, working with me is a kind of restitution, which I consider to be much more constructive than if I turn around and let them suffer. Also, I might say, one thing which I've learned in the camp is not to generalize. So when I was back home, many friends of mine who were Germans, some of my best friends were German, some of my best friends are Jews, right? I singled those out who had absolutely nothing to do with National Socialism, who were very supportive, sent me parcels in concentration camps, which few people know it could be done, even to Auschwitz, Birkenau, I got parcels. Were asked to write, and obviously I wrote, some of the things I wrote in Latin, So those people who censored the mail couldn't understand, but those recipients did. So as a response, I got parcels to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Quite a few did, which made all the difference, because in many cases it was a lifesaver. So then when I returned, and they were to be penalized the same way, regardless, merely because they're Germans, they had to be Nazis. Not true. And those people then I supported, and in many cases saved their lives. And that was something which I had learned in a camp. Not to behave like Nazis. And it's still my principle, and when I see all the hatred and all that, I'm sickened because people haven't learned anything. I'm sickened what is happening in Israel. I'm sickened by it. I can't accept it. Because when you say, what is happening? What have they learned? What do people have to suffer before they learn a lesson and behave differently?
So you're saying what was done to them, they're doing to
That's right, in a way. I mean, we have to be very careful and not to overgeneralize. But if I throw a stone at you, I shouldn't shoot you in return. Which is not to say that they should not protect their interests, absolutely. But the question is how it is being done, what sort of strategies are employed, and what can we do so that violence will not escalate.
Yeah, so like the end,
That's right.
means don't justify the end.
That's right. And there are some lessons which I've learned, and that's how I got it out of my system and continue to system. So when I'm surrounded with people who come out of the woodwork and say they're all experts in the Holocaust, all of a sudden everyone is an expert. Only those people who were actually there no longer really count that much, you know. I'm getting a little bit concerned about that.
So are you saying that it never really gets out of your system? I mean, it's not
I think you get it out of your system. I don't have any nightmares. If I have nightmares which relate to the nuclear Holocaust, potential nuclear Holocaust, or about the more recent development in Czechoslovakia, yes. I have nightmares about that. But I don't have nightmares about concentration camps at all.
Well, let me just add to some of the things that John said, and maybe more than now. A lot of survivors and a lot of the children of survivors have a lot of difficulty putting the stuff behind them. I think everybody's, given who human beings are, quite variable.
Should be a unique, individual.
You think of the case last year of Primo Levi killing himself. Here's a man who epitomized all of the wonderful things in terms of a writer, and he wound up killing himself, for which he had everything to live for at that point in time, and yet he couldn't put his experiences behind him. You see a lot of survivors having difficulties adjusting, and the children of their survivors. There was a very touching piece in the Jewish Bulletin last year. Things that are happening in Brooklyn now, just gives a feeding ground for the people in the West Bank. You get people who are fanatics. That's the way they handled it. That is, they turn the experience around in such a way to say is, the lesson we learned is that we will never ever have anything happen again, and we will push that to the max, and which is not just simply, there's reasonable levels of response, and then there's extreme, the points that John was mentioning.
Right.
So each groups of people respond differently, and some people don't put it behind them. They don't work very well.
Yeah, I think that's very correct. Except many people are not being helped to put things behind them. And I like to compare a little bit with the Vietnam War veterans who came back, and that's a very important thing, which is pretty much in connection with your question. When we came back, we are not welcomed at all. We were burned. Except there was an official policy that indeed we were supposed to be heroes for whatever reason, rightly or wrong. And very frequently not even very much supported, except officially, yes, but not socially. Because we were a burden and very frequently reminded other people that they did not do what they should have done, namely support us.
Or the other side of it, I just want to be a little bit ironic, is they failed to get rid of all the Jews.
Well, that is particularly in areas in which anti-Semitism ran rampant. And I've heard this precisely said from some Poles. Hitler didn't do a good enough a job. There are still Jews around in Poland. He should have really cleaned it up for good. And I've heard very specifically, I remember one Polish official, communist official, who said just that. And all this Christianity and Catholicism and whore Mary and the bastard Jesus, all these should be wiped of our philosophy, and we should not have anything of that nature anymore.
Well, you get that feeling from Escape from Sobibor too, because there's numerous times in the book they say the Poles were sometimes even greater enemy than the Nazis.
Right.
So I mean that just get that feeling from the start.
And we've also heard that from some of the panelists who were addressing. Yeah. Yeah.
You had a man in the red shirt. You had a question?
Yeah, this is kind of off track, I'm sorry, but I just wanted to know, did the American press have knowledge of what was actually occurring in the concentration camps?
Well, they had knowledge fairly early in the game. The first time when some people were able to escape from concentration camps and bring personal messages to officials, except, and they received them except they failed to officially recognize it and spread it. They just refused to accept it as reality.
That was including the New York Times, which was owned by German Jews. So you have to understand that there were Jewish groups that had been transmitting this information to the press, and the press refused to print it.
Richard, John, what was the date and who was the individual who got out of the camps and went to England? They wouldn't believe him, and he committed suicide.
Yeah, I know exactly. I just can't tell it. I forget that.
But that really puts the date on it.
Right, but specific. But he was by no means the only one.
Another Jew told them.
Evelyn,
Louder, very true. And I've looked at some of the older editions, and they wrote about things as rumors or as possibilities or terrible news, except it was not front page. It did not make front page.
I was talking about this with my son, who's in college somewhere else, and he's an undergraduate. He's taken a lot of modern American history, and I was talking about the fact that I had heard that Roosevelt actually loved, and my father cried when he heard Roosevelt died. And I suppose that he knew about the camps and told the planes not to bomb the railroad tracks at the camps. My son told me that even in our country there's a lot of anti-Semitism. They used to call the New Deal the Jew Deal. And I guess Frankfurter and the people who were there were very disliked.
Well, Frankfurter himself absolutely refused to believe that Jews were exterminated. That was actually an interview on Channel 9 last night. Was a doc on just very thing, a report on just that very thing, that someone who actually came here as a witness to inform Roosevelt and Frankfurter and other people. Frankfurter said, well, I'll be very frank with you, I just can't believe what you're telling me.
So is it true that Roosevelt knew and he told him that?
Oh yes, oh no, there's no question about it. That's documented.
There's an interview, an episode in Ben Heck's book, A Child of the Century, if anybody remembers that, which he has a friend of his who was a high-level Jewish advisor to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt made a variety of anti-Semitic remarks, and the man just walked down to Roosevelt's office and never broke with Roosevelt again, and just it was very well known about his anti-Semitism.
He was anti-Semitic. But then also Roosevelt was supposed to be a big supporter of Israel.
That's right. She was a mensch.
But those are two different people.
But the only problem with Eleanor was, I met her, by the way, back in Berkeley, and she went to her lecture, and then afterwards I met her. She was very protective of her husband, and that is one thing which I found fault, and she was also very naive about the Soviet Union. These are the two things which I think were, but she was a real humanist, there's no question about it. Was a tremendous human being. And I remember when we all said after the lecture, it said, Eleanor for president, and I said,
Question.
It apparently was pretty well documented by fall of 42 what was going on. Certainly this country knew about it as well as England, and yet as was mentioned, that the combination of the State Department, which was threw every roadblock that it possibly could in keeping the lid on information and in fact preventing anything from happening, and a disbelieving public and press.
And plus a certain underlying anti-Semitism.
Well,
That is so what?
Well, this anti-Semitism, I think, prevented also American Jews by large, exception to the rule, not to support what happened to the Jews, or not to intervene. And that is one thing which we see today. There are so many people of older generation, and they try to atone for that somehow, and now come out of the woodwork, so to speak, and deal with the Holocaust that already did it.
Moving into Germany, that there wasn't the American Jews with the European cousins coming over. It's like they won't like us anymore if there are too many. Well, they're going to bring old world ways and we'll be prejudiced against and we'll get the backlash. And so it's really similar situation.
So,
There was some attempt to bring individual Germans over. I was involved in that, and I know other people were. Affidavits had to be obtained to indicate that they were...
And they don't need it. They just come here because of political reasons. But I came here as a political refugee, but I had to have an affidavit too.
They brought in all the German scientists without affidavits.
That's right.
But they were hiring them.
They flew them in. They flew them
That was
in
proof of
officially.
responsibility.
Right. Flew them in. Von Braun is one very specific example. Not only that, Von Braun was also a member.
In one of our earlier series, Les Adler gave a lecture in which he talked about the Jewish children that were going to try to get in the late 30s under provisions of the Wagner bill that was being proposed by Senator Wagner from New York. And it was a bill which, it's all fading now, but the gist of it was allowing a certain number, like 10 or 20,000 children, the majority of which were going to be Jews, all of which had sponsors. And Roosevelt would not support the bill because, in effect, he felt doing that would leave him open to being too pro-Jewish.
I don't know how to form it into a question, but in your opinion, what about this happening again? I know there's been atrocities all over the world in history, and is it a special case in the area? Are the circumstances right for it to happen anywhere else? You know, in a freer society?
I'm not quite sure.
Jewish people or what?
Well, having the Holocaust, mass extermination, could it happen in America? Could it happen in...
Well, it is happening. You know, it is happening in Ethiopia. It is happening in Kampuchea. 2 million people were destroyed for ideological reasons by their own people. But I'm trying to learn what can be learned from the past so that we can prevent things of that nature in the future. That's all I'm interested in. I'm not interested in spreading hatred. I'm not interested in pointing the finger. I'm interested in what are the dynamics, the circumstances under which these things can happen. That's what is my interest.
And you think any culture is capable of it, given the circumstances?
No. There are certain cultures which are perhaps more resistant, more resilient against this sort of genocidal thing. But there are societies indeed which are genocidal, so what I would call genocidal societies, which have the tendencies towards that possibility, particularly where you've got a great degree of prejudice, racism, and societies which stress ideology. Ideology is actually, if we really want to be specific, at the bottom of most of these problems. People who think ideologically rather than in perspectives. They adhere and have a need to adhere to belief and myth systems, which is precisely what an ideology is. And I think that's the great danger. We really have to put where it is really central as to what makes a genocidal society.
sort of pertaining to your question, something that's kind of frightening me is seeing kids today that, like, skinheads, and they don't know why they're in their group, in that group. I think that you could probably ask 75% of them, why are you a skinhead? They won't say, well, I'm anti-Semitic. They don't know why they're in that group. They know that they want to belong to that group because peers, some of their peers that are important to them are in that group, and that's frightening because if something were to get rolling on that, a lot of them would blindly follow their peers, and something could happen, I think, if that were to really snowball. Because it's very common. I've been out, and I never knew what a skinhead. Went out with one of my friends and said, what on earth, what is this group? And she told me, and it wasn't until I was in here that I knew that's what their group was about, was anti-Semitism and things like that. And I don't think that half those kids know that that's what it's all about. I think they're just in it to be in it with their friends and their peers.
Well, very frequently they join any sort of movement in order not to be isolated, in order to have companionship, in order to be able to relate to some other peers. So they join groups or in movements because of their very acute feeling of isolation, regardless of the ideological contents of that particular group or movement. We see that also in gangs, for example. The intent of the gang members is not to do what they actually do, but to have someone, to have companionship.
I also think it's important to remember that there's not just one cause, that it's true that our government may have withheld information, but it's also true that people often don't want to know. I mean, when you think of what we're doing to the American Indians and their religion, we're simply wiping out a people. By the year 2000, there probably won't be any American Indians. But very few people are concerned. I mean, you ask an American Indian, what did they think of the Bureau of Indian Affairs? And their answer will be a lot different than anything that our government might say about what we do for our Indians.
Well, very specifically, the Indian situation have been...
Yeah, but you couldn't tell who they were.
Well, there were more of them, that's all, and they're all interrelated. And it's very difficult to put all these people in internment camps, to be sure. It was technically rather difficult, to be sure. But still, that's not meting out justice equally, right? It's lopsided merely because someone is of a different race. Of course, they stand out more and can be rounded up more readily, to be sure.
But say, could I comment to what the young lady said was,
Right.
Maybe we encamped the wrong people, since we couldn't tell them by looking at them. Maybe those were the ones we should have put fences around.
And to be sure that very many Germans, American Germans, were very active against the United States, collaborated and trying to find ways and means to collaborate with Nazi Germany. So for all practical purposes, they're much greater potential danger than the Japanese ever were. And they proved it also in terms of the various espionage cases and so forth, which are a matter of record.
With our heavy emphasis on consumerism in this country, I see a gradual diminution, a gradual moving out of our society, people who can only be consumers and not producers. And I'm thinking about the developmentally disabled, the mentally ill, people as they get older. There's a de-emphasis on their humanity and more emphasis on what it's costing to house them. And as an illustration with people with disabilities, there are 37 million identifiable people in this country with disabilities and a 60% unemployment rate. Do we not have some of those insidious things going on that we need to be aware of in this country?
I think so. I think so, that people who simply are producers, who are financially dependent, are more and more relegated to second-class citizens.
I have to come to the root of the whole thing. Since we haven't talked that much, in the actual lecture series about today, my question is, and it can be your personal opinion or research or whatever, what is the reason for anti-Semitism in the United States today, and how can we break out of that mold?
Well, I don't think that's very different from what it used to be before. The Jews are viewed by large, and still are, as Christ killers, for which they have to atone. And that is actually the traditional anti-Semitism, that they are being blamed for the death of Christ, in spite of the racial brand of anti-Semitism. But I don't think we have the racial brand of anti-Semitism in the United States, if I'm not mistaken. We have the traditional brand of anti-Semitism. They are different. They don't believe in Jesus Christ because that's a Protestant nation. We are a Protestant nation. And much of the Protestant Christianity is based on Luther. And Luther was a well-known anti-Semite. And that has spread to the United States from Europe, particularly.
Yeah, but that's historically. I'm talking about modern times. Most people wouldn't even have a clue.
Well, but you see, this is so ingrained, culturally so ingrained, that I don't think it has changed any. So, although some may not necessarily be devout Christians, they still have remnants of this sort of cultural Christianity, because a religion is not just a religion which does not have any effect on the social interaction, on social behavior. So much of the religion also is culturally ingrained, socially ingrained. Better understand the nature of prejudice, prejudging something without having the facts.
Don't you think it has something to do also? Your answer there, I just got a few words in, but
go right ahead.
I just can't stay out. That's really what I meant to say. However, I don't think it's so much with anti-Semitism. I don't think it's so much a religious question in this country. I think that there are, for a minority perhaps of Americans, an inability to accept that this country is a multi-ethnic and multi-racial country. I was particularly struck by that thought when I happened to be in France this past summer. And for the first time that I could ever remember reading in a French newspaper, a French politician said, and he was speaking essentially about Jean-Marie Le Pen, the right wing, that this is a multiracial, multi-ethnic country, and they have a more traditional view of the United States. And I think that Jews as a group have been put essentially among, one of the ethnic groups that is not considered equally with other segments of the population.
But I would like to respond to that. I don't quite agree. I don't quite agree with your analysis. Primarily, and that is precisely what I think needs to be pointed out, that the white Protestant Anglo-Saxon and anyone who does not belong to that will have problems, and that is somehow changing now, I think. But it's still dominant.
I don't know that I'd use the term Protestant. Maybe Protestant politic are the people in power.
Protestant ethic.
I don't think so. I don't think a lot of our political leaders today, especially a lot of our, in the United States, a lot of our political leaders, television leaders, sports leaders, etc., have that Protestant ethic in their background. They might allude to it they might allude to it when it's beneficial to them in their careers.
But it is their background, nevertheless.
Behavior.
They are white, Protestant, Anglo-Saxon.
That's the background, but I don't see that as the underlying makeup of the people today as it's being used in this course, I guess, or in this discussion.
You know,
I would-
John, what
that's-
A little bit problems.
John, what
I'm
you said, I
along
don't
with-
think that disagrees too much with what I didn't
I'm
flesh
along
out
with-
some of my
yeah.
ideas, but I would say that that there are people who consider that the women's liberation, the black liberation movement, the demand for ethnic minorities to play an equal role in the country has essentially altered what used to be the old traditional powers, which were essentially caught up with what we call the white Anglo-Saxon power bloc that ran the country for years and years and years. And that's
still is.
changed very dramatically in the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, but it still is, in essence, it still is. I mean, it's changing, to be sure.
Well, it's changing, but there's a resistance to it. California is facing this very issue right today. The legislature ignored, and the governor ignored completely the changing composition of the California population. You have a large number of Hispanics, Asian, and in the short, what is it, in the next decade, why they'll constitute a majority, and but that's completely ignored in the policies that are being for our state. So,
Right.
it's going to change, but it's changing
Very
reluctantly.
slowly. Yeah.
Just think of what the attitude of having a black president would be. There's a lot of resistance to that, whether people like Jesse Jackson or not. The fact is that the man is black. And the feeling is that because he is black, people will not vote for him.
Probably a very accurate assessment.
Regardless of his background.
Huh?
Regardless of his background.
You know, it might also be interesting to point out that Dukakis is the first Greek American who has ever reached a stage in the election process that he's reached.
And John F. Kennedy was a Catholic, first Catholic.
Tukmagin must
I'd
be the
like
first
to
Armenian.
address her question now with a very practical incident that occurred a year, I think it's like about 5 years ago, when the farmers were having a very tough time in the Midwest. There were incidences of anti-Semitic remarks and things like that developing. And the Anti-Defamation League, as B'nai B'rith, I believe it was, or maybe one of the other nationwide Jewish organizations, went to study the situation. And a poll was taken. And the results of that poll were that 13% of the people in the Midwest, in these areas of having problems, like the farmers always have problems, 13% believed that the Jews had too much power in this country. This is a published statistic. Now, it shook me up. The 13 much. But if things got worse, if things got really tough, and these farmers really organized, and they went to their Grange meeting, and each one of them just convinced one more person, that would have been over 20, over 1 out of 4 people would have had some prejudice against the Jews. If that didn't happen, only 13%. But that's how close, I mean, woken. In the way of a massive depression or something.
Yeah,
It
but
was
too much
there.
too
Now,
much
where did it
power
came
doesn't
from?
relate to I don't like you.
Oh,
Okay, it doesn't always, just because if I say, hey, you know, that,
That's the first step.
No, but
Okay.
it's prejudice because they said it's our poverty is the fault of those Jewish bankers
right.
like Rockefeller. Right? So Jew is being used not as a description of a real person, but as a pejorative. And obviously
Is a combination of lack of sophistication, fear, and laziness. You see, if you are a farmer and you're in trouble, you could take the time, if you have the degree of sophistication, and look into it and check and examine and arrive at a conclusion that would tell you really why you're in trouble. But that would take time, it would take effort, and it would take a lot of energy, and it's much easier, and it...
Because you are known sexist.
On that note,
How about our connection to Israel as American Jews? And I mean, is you're not seen as a Jew unless your mother is Jewish in the eyes of Israel? how about our assimilation into American society and keeping culture going? I mean, not necessarily as the religion, though some may argue that that's inseparable, but how about, is that going to be important? So assuming something can happen in America, and will we need to have our connection to Israel?
You almost can answer that yourself better than we can.
I guess I kind of want an open answer, saying that, you know.
Someone who's converted can also be admitted that they're converted. And the argument in Israel now is over how the conversion was accomplished. In other words, the effort has been made to limit it to solely to Orthodox conversion, but they haven't done that yet.
One interesting article I read when it was trying to analyze and break down why the Jews were picked on. People were no longer Jewish as far as practicing Jews, Orthodox Jews in their faith, but they were Jewish because of their race.
What is the race? I mean, I'm interested in what you're talking about. Because I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, think about the, one of the articles I'm thinking about, are in the book anyway, Escape from Sobibor, Shlomo. He was Jewish, but he wasn't a practicing Jew. He considered himself part of the Jewish race. In the other book, they fought back. It was separated into those categories. It was just, okay, Catholics, they have a strike against them because they're Catholic. I mean, according to this breakout. Mexicans, they have a strike against them because they're Mexican. But the Jewish had two strikes against them. They were a different race and they were a different religion, completely from what we accepted.
Well,
whether or not we buy the theory, it's just...
What Hitler claimed is something very specific. Is reflected in its writings and...
It's unfortunate that there was a misconception, misuse of the English language there, a serious misuse, because they're confusing in both those articles race with nation.
I'm not saying they're right or wrong.
No, that's what I'm saying. I'm addressing myself to the article. Not to you, I'm addressing myself to the article. Because the Jews, up until the State of Israel was reborn in 1948, were a nation in exile. That's who we were. And the nation had many races. The Ethiopians we were just talking about, they're blacks, you say. There are Jews of all races in this nation, you say. So, for someone to say, I am of the Jewish race, they're misusing, either they don't know them, or they confuse the words.
Or they have adopted National Socialist thinking.
Yeah, or that's the third one, adopted National Socialist thinking.
This is going to seem totally different. I'd just like to know how many other groups, it seems like there's a lot of survivors that have come to live in this area of California. Are there other communities like this across the United States?
Oh yeah, Skokie, Queens.
And I don't know
Is there a reason
that there are so many. I don't even know that
I
there are
don't
so
know, but
many.
it just seems like that there, you know, we've had quite a bit of...
They may be.
I think they're pretty well scattered through the country, depending upon where they had relatives, people that were from their towns, or other reasons why they went to live in certain places.
But are there communities that are actually providing this kind of service and telling people about what happened, other than yours?
I don't think there are very many, and if there are, I don't know.
New York.
New York has a large
Well,
New York would be New York would be obviously probably the largest.
Just a reminder on that, give you just some perspective. The state of California, I think, is the only one, or the first, that has mandated this in the educational system as of 2 years ago. And that's a major reason.
I don't think that's correct.
Are there others?
The curriculum in the East Coast states, New York, New Jersey, are very extensive and very well developed.
But there are only a few.
Massachusetts.
Massachusetts. 2 or 3. Okay.
Well, there's more than that. That's so
So I always hate to keep asking the same question, but I guess I'm curious from the point of view of the people who are Jewish or consider themselves Jewish here today. How many of you feel prejudiced against, or I don't want to use the word persecuted, but that, because I think that, you know, statistically that may be totally correct what you said of the 13%. But have you ever done a little, if in fact you really, if your answer is yes, if you did a little game or something and said for, 2 years or a year, I'm not going to tell anybody I'm Jewish, would it make a difference? Do you understand what I'm saying? As far as, is it the fact that if you did feel that way, where you felt a prejudice if you were Jewish, is it the fact that you told somebody that, or they don't like you personally, or what? Do you understand what I mean? I'm sure that has to have gone through your mind if you were Jewish.
Well, maybe my answer isn't valid because I'm from New York and everybody can tell from my
Oh, not me.
choice of thinking I'm Italian or however, in 1970, when I'm in California, I filed a lawsuit against a restaurant because of sex discrimination, and was in the newspaper and on the television just as a person, as a woman, filing this lawsuit. I was totally shocked by the number of telephone calls and letters I got that were blatantly anti-Semitic and extremely sick. And as a matter of fact, I wasn't prepared for that at all. And I turned them over to the Anti-Defamation League as proof that anti-Semitism is alive.
Oh, and you have a Jewish type name, quote
Well,
unquote.
as a matter of fact, at that time I was using my first husband's name, which was, I suppose, Jewish, but that's all. They didn't hear me speak. My nose isn't quite that extreme. I didn't have a permanent at the time. All I had was this name attached to me. And yet, virulent anti-Semitic.
I would imagine from that question that most people, I'm not going to say all, but most people feel discriminated against at one point or another for various reasons. Like I know I felt discriminated against because I'm a female. I felt discriminated against because I have blonde hair. I would imagine that most people have been discriminated against or have at least felt discriminated against for one reason or another, because you're short, because you're tall, because you're tall. Pardon me?
Is it real?
Yeah, it's turning brown now, but it's real blonde. But I would imagine that most people have felt discriminated against for one reason or another, rational or not. So kind of.
I don't know. I've also done a great deal of anti-Semitic type things, and it was really frightening, and I don't exactly look Jewish either, and I don't have a very Jewish-sounding last name. I remember I walked out to my car, and it was just plastered in swastika. It was little slogans from the National Party. These horrible red and black and white stickers. I mean, you couldn't even see the car. And the next day it was the same thing. And then when I got to school, my locker was coated in them too. So whoever it was knew my car, knew my locker. And on my parents' lawn, someone had spray painted.
Where were you living at the time?
Los Angeles. And when I came up here to Northern California, just the fact that people hadn't really come into contact with the great Billowing Jews, I was sort of like an odd, like an animal. I really wanted to, what does it mean to be Jewish? And that I got a lot of negative feedback, a lot of strange responses, because they hadn't contacted Jews. They didn't know how to treat them.
Another group of them. I was also in the Peace Corps in Bolivia. And Bolivia may be representative of the rest of South America or not. But there were two incidents. One is when I was known as, finally in one little town, somebody said I was Jewish. Little school children will come up to me and said, Missy, why did you kill Christ? And then a fellow school teacher, after a while, who respected
Did you wipe the blood off your hands when you went to the
And then a fellow school teacher came over to me and said, I knew you weren't a real American. In my class, I teach at the junior college, last week, students were talking about this issue, and she said, well, do you do like, the rest of, like the normal American? Are you, like we Americans do it this way. Do you do it this way?
That is the Protestant ethics that they're.
How long ago was that?
And that's so buried and unconscious. That's
10 years?
Well, the incident in the junior college was last week.
She said last week.
Her responses aren't all that unusual. Not at all. I had experience like that. I thought I was the one who killed Christ. I'm sorry. Yeah. I mean, 40 years ago, I was going to give my last name because there were quotas in Berkeley about where Jews could live, about being admitted to the university. I mean, that doesn't happen now. And it would never occur to any of my daughters not to admit freely that they're Jewish. But I am still reticent. I don't bring it out in normal conversation.
Well, I'm a little bit of each, and I'm proud to have a Jewish girl in the family.
5 Jewish boys. 2 professional veterinary fraternities. If you're in the faculty, you're a faculty member, you belong to one of the others. White, Christian, men only. Jewish boys were not allowed in.
Neither women are, too, so that...
Well, first of all, they didn't let women in the veterinary school at all. Yeah, there had to be something wrong with them. One woman they let in had to go off their one hand. 1954.
Well, actually, that kind of quota was true in colleges throughout
That's
the
right.
country when I was going to college.
That's right.
Certainly. And that's, I mean, it was not unusual. It wasn't just in veterinarian schools. It was in colleges in general.
That's right.
But it's interesting to me, since I wasn't born here, I'm a war bride, that we don't admit it here. In countries in Europe, you knew they had what was called a numerus clausus. Only so many were admitted, but here we act like it doesn't exist.
That's right. It was all sub rosa.
That's right.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think we need to recognize that this country does have a long history of discrimination, not only against Jews, but of blacks and Asians and Chicanos and Indians. For example, watch what will happen in the paper, Indians. Watch what happens in the paper, for example, if Congress does approve this bill to give all Japanese Americans who served in the prison camps, concentration camps, $20,000. There will be a backlash. Sure.
And say so-and-so Jew, and there is a lot of anti-Semitic behavior going on.
Can I ask you a question? Because this relates to something different. We brought your father here, and he took part in the panel. Had he just talked to you much before about his experiences during the Holocaust?
Yes, he has. He knew the story. He's now, a sole survivor. So, there wasn't. Some of the cousins know in Israel, and there's nobody.
Has it been difficult for him to talk about it?
No, he's much more open to it now.
That's what I...
But
how long has it been that he's been able to talk about it?
Well, my brother's 30, and he told my brother when my brother was about 9 or 10. So.
What I was saying is that you mentioned civil rights laws in the 60s, and that yesterday the Supreme Court decided to review those, and so that in order to make private discrimination legal again. And I just thought I'd mention that in going along with all this, the government legislation. And also yesterday they passed a law against genocide, which seems kind of ironic to.
The prejudice may be in fashion again, is what you're saying. Depending on, they have to rehear the case. That's not. They decided to listen again.
Right.
I went to the concentration camps in Poland and Germany and everything. And I was really surprised at how pretty they all are. I mean, the parks, they're really pretty, and I went to
Could you be specific which ones you're referring to?
Birkenau, Dachau, Auschwitz, and particularly Auschwitz even had a place to eat. I was like looking for the gift shop, it was really absurd. And but Birkenau was lovely. The fields and fields of flowers. It was, it was sort of.
I think it's well fertilized.
Yeah.
It was such a joke, really.
Probably lots of poppies.
Yeah.
In Dachau, they have it says, "Come see our historic camp." It's almost. It's in English.
Well, maybe they're afraid that they won't get people to come unvisited unless they give them some amenities to make them comfortable once they're there.
John, do you have a comment about that, the appearance of the camps?
Well, Dachau, for example, is none of the original things actually stand there, and there have been rebuilt things. So you don't really see anything which used to be there, or when I was there, even after the war. So for some reason, they destroyed that. It was also used as a prisoner of war camp after the inmates had left. So most of the barracks, which original barracks, no longer stand there. What you really see is nothing very much, except some of the barracks which are new and which have the exhibit there. I didn't recognize it, and then you have some 3 different churches, by the way, in Dachau, which really aggravated me. We still have equal but separate. With the Jewish synagogue, you've got the Catholic one, and you've got a Protestant. Unbelievable, what have people learned? Couldn't they put a structure there together so that all of them who were there would feel united in a struggle against that type of evil? And I was shocked to see that. So yes, it does not really. There are some camps, however, which have remained pretty like they used to leave them, except they've deteriorated a little bit. But I agree with you. I think some of these camps are not at all representative as to what they used to be or what they used to like, as to look like. And they become something else, and are very deceptive in terms of what took place there.
I would see that really as a danger in history. I mean, you should not trivialize important things in history. I was fortunate enough to visit a slave house in Senegal. Perhaps some of you have been there. It's on the island of Gorée, and it's a place where all slaves were transported from Africa to the Americas. And it's really used as a place of pilgrimage. George Bush, when he went to Senegal, had to go out to this slave house and sign the guest book. And there are very appropriate messages that are kind of hung up on the walls of the slave house, which more or less, relate to the use that it would do, and they're appropriate to the historical monument that it is. And I had heard from people who had gone to Germany that oftentimes there will be a monument in the concentration camps that will quite literally say something like 50,000 people were put to death in this camp, when in fact thousands more or millions more were put to death. And that's something we'll need to guard against, trivializing some of the significant spots in history.
Or distorting facts. Yeah.
As a matter of fact, Tom Blatt, who was one of the panel survivors, his mission is to try to see that at Sobibor it's properly identified. He's objected to the way the Polish government identified the place. They identified all people who were killed there, where it was primarily Jews, and they didn't mention the Jews. And this is, he's been struggling to get this rectified, so this is, you had a first-hand opportunity to hear a man who was dealing with this very problem. Next week, we're hoping to have a panel that will discuss other genocides. We've been talking about one, probably in terms of knowledge about it, in terms of how it was done. It was one of the most horrible, but to the people who died, I guess any genocide is horrible. And so we're going to have at least a discussion about that so we can get a broader perspective.
And also next Wednesday night, the 4th of May, is good.
You want
May I
to
have the clipboard back? Okay. Next Wednesday night, the 4th of May, is the play good at the Actors Theater, the Lincoln Arts Center. If you need directions for getting there, those of you who signed up, just ask me outside.
Anything else which is open-ended, which you need to tie up? Be sure to second paper
When?
as soon as possible.